The White House has made its first comment since President Trump sparked a row by saying that NATO troops had stayed a little off the front lines during the war in Afghanistan. Britain's Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer said the words were insulting and appalling. Prince Harry, who served in Afghanistan, has called for the sacrifices of NATO soldiers to be spoken about truthfully and with respect. While the White House's Deputy Press Secretary said that Mr. Trump was right to have stressed that America's contribution to NATO dwarfed those of other countries. There was no direct response to the outrage caused. Lee Milner reports.
From the Times to the Express, newspapers across the nation led this morning with a single demand: an apology from President Trump. It comes after his comments sparked outrage and offence, belittling the sacrifices made by NATO and British troops during the Afghanistan war in 2006.
Donald Trump is scared, and I mean genuinely, deeply scared, in a way that goes beyond his usual bluster and bravado. Because right now, legal experts across the country are talking about something that keeps him up at night: prison. Not a few months in some minimum security facility, not house arrest at Mara Lago with an ankle bracelet. We are talking about the possibility of spending the rest of his life behind bars. The numbers are staggering when you actually look at them. A political analysis calculated that the maximum statutory penalties across Trump's federal and state charges could total around 641 years in prison. Now, nobody expects him to actually serve 641 years. That is obviously impossible. But the fact that his legal exposure is measured in centuries rather than years tells you something important about the scale of what he is facing. And when you look at the realistic guideline estimates, the ranges that actual sentencing experts calculate based on how similar defendants are treated, you are still looking at potentially 17 to 22 years just for the classified documents case alone. For a man who is 79 years old, that is effectively a life sentence.
We have never really asked anything of them. You know, they'll say they sent some troops to Afghanistan or this or that. And they did. They stayed a little back.
The conflict was triggered after the US asked for NATO allies to help battle the Taliban in the aftermath of the September the 11th attacks. Robert Dickett's from Kent lost his only child, Oliver, who was based in Helmand, the scene of the heaviest fighting. He was one of the 457 British service personnel who died.
President Trump needs to get his history right, his knowledge of history.
Now, let me be clear about what we are discussing here. Trump is not going to prison tomorrow. He is currently the President of the United States. Department of Justice policy says you cannot indict a sitting president. The Supreme Court has granted him some immunity protections for official acts. He has political power that shields him from the kind of accountability that ordinary citizens face. But here's the thing, that political protection is not permanent. It depends on him staying in office. It depends on Republicans maintaining enough power to block prosecution. It depends on the legal landscape not shifting against him. And every single one of those protections could disappear. When they do, when Trump is no longer shielded by the presidency and political allies, he faces criminal exposure that could put him away for the rest of his natural life. That is not hyperbole. That is what the law says. That is what the evidence supports, and that is why Trump is so desperate to stay in power and so terrified of what happens if he loses it. Former Special Counsel Jack Smith just reminded everyone exactly how serious this is. In his January 2026 testimony before Congress, Smith told lawmakers that both of his federal indictments against Trump were supported by proof beyond a reasonable doubt that Trump engaged in criminal activity. He said he would bring the same charges again on the same facts. He emphasized that the Espionage Act and obstruction charges in the documents case involved highly sensitive materials and deliberate concealment, exactly the kind of conduct that usually yields substantial prison time when ordinary defendants are convicted. Smith was not speculating or giving his opinion. He was stating what his investigation found. He was telling Congress under oath that Donald Trump is a criminal who deserves to be prosecuted and imprisoned. The only reason that has not happened is timing and politics, not the strength of the evidence. Now, let us really dig into the numbers, because understanding exactly how much prison time Trump faces is essential to understanding why he is so scared. This is not about partisan accusations or political rhetoric. This is about federal sentencing guidelines that apply to everyone. This is about maximum statutory penalties set by Congress. This is about how the justice system treats defendants who do what Trump did. And when you look at the actual calculations, the ranges that legal experts have worked through in detail, the conclusion is unavoidable. Donald Trump faces the realistic possibility of dying in prison if he is ever held fully accountable for his crimes. Let me walk you through case by case. Let us start with the classified documents case, because that is where Trump's exposure is most severe. Jack Smith's indictment charged Trump with multiple counts under the Espionage Act for willful retention of national defense information. Each of those counts carries a maximum penalty of 10 years in prison. But Trump was not charged with just one count. He was charged with multiple counts, each one representing a different classified document that he illegally retained. When you add up the maximum penalties for all the Espionage Act counts, you are already looking at decades of potential prison time. And that is before you even get to the obstruction charges. The obstruction charges in the documents case are where the exposure gets really serious. Trump was charged with obstruction of justice for his efforts to hide classified documents from investigators, to lie to his own lawyers, to direct others, to move boxes and delete security footage, and to resist the government's efforts to retrieve materials that belong to the American people. Obstruction of an official proceeding carries a maximum penalty of 20 years in prison. 20 years for a single count. And the indictment included multiple obstruction-related charges. When legal experts at Just Security ran the sentencing guidelines analysis, accounting for the sensitivity of the materials, Trump's leadership role in the conspiracy, his abuse of trust as a former president, and his obstruction of the investigation, they calculated that his guideline range could be around 210 to 262 months. That is approximately 17, 1.5 to 22 years in federal prison for the documents case alone. Now let us add the election interference case. Smith also charged Trump with conspiracy to defraud the United States, conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding, obstruction of an official proceeding, and conspiracy against rights. These charges relate to Trump's efforts to overturn the 2020 election, the pressure on state officials, the fake elector scheme, the pressure on Mike Pence, and the events leading to January 6th. The obstruction charges again carry maximum penalties of 20 years each. The conspiracy charges carry significant penalties as well. When legal experts calculated the guideline ranges for the election case, they estimated roughly 5 to 9 years, depending on which counts a jury convicted on and what enhancements applied. That is on top of the 17 to 22 years from the documents case. We are now potentially looking at more than 25 years in federal prison, and we have not even gotten to the state charges yet. Georgia is where Trump faces racketeering charges. The Fulton County indictment charged Trump under Georgia's RICO statute, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, for his role in the conspiracy to overturn Georgia's election results. The famous phone call where Trump asked Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger to find enough votes to flip the state is central to this case. Georgia's RICO charge carries a maximum sentence of 20 years in prison. There are also multiple counts of making false statements to government officials, each carrying up to 5 years. When you add up all the Georgia charges, you are looking at additional decades of potential prison time on top of the federal exposure. And Georgia state charges cannot be pardoned by a federal president. Even if Trump tried to pardon himself federally, he would still face the Georgia case. Then there is the New York case, where Trump has already been convicted. The Manhattan District Attorney charged Trump with 34 felony counts of falsifying business records in connection with the hush money payments to Stormy Daniels. Each count carried a maximum penalty of 4 years in prison. Trump was convicted on all 34 counts. That is a maximum theoretical exposure of 136 years, though sentences would typically run concurrently rather than consecutively. In the end, Judge Juan Merchan imposed an unconditional discharge. No jail time, no fines, no probation, just the conviction itself. Many people saw this as Trump getting off easy, and in a sense, he did. The judge explicitly acknowledged that an ordinary defendant would likely have faced harsher punishment, but the case was complicated by Trump's status as president-elect when sentencing occurred, and the constitutional issues that raised it. The important thing is that Trump is now a convicted felon. A court found him guilty beyond a reasonable doubt of 34 felonies. That conviction stands, regardless of whether he served time. Let me put all of this together so you can see the full picture. The documents case could yield 17 to 22 years under the guidelines. The election case could yield 5 to 9 years. The Georgia RICO case could yield up to 20 years, plus additional time for other counts. The New York case resulted in a conviction, but no imprisonment, though it establishes him as a felon. When you add up the realistic guideline estimates, not the theoretical maximums, but what experts actually calculate based on how the system works, you are looking at potentially 30 to 40 years or more of combined prison exposure. For Donald Trump, at age 79, that is a life sentence. He would die in prison long before serving that much time. And that is why the phrase life in prison is not an exaggeration. It is a realistic description of what Trump faces if he ever loses the political protection that is currently shielding him from accountability. All right, so let us break down what all of this means practically. Why is Trump not in prison right now if his exposure is so severe? What is protecting him, and what would have to change for the talk of life in prison to become reality? Because understanding the gap between Trump's legal exposure and his current situation is essential to understanding the political dynamics of his second term. He is not fighting so hard to stay in power just because he loves being president. He is fighting because he knows what happens if he loses. Let me walk you through the factors that are keeping him out of prison and how each of them could potentially change. The first and most important protection is the presidency itself. Under long-standing Department of Justice policy, a sitting president cannot be indicted or criminally prosecuted. This policy is based on the idea that criminal proceedings would interfere with the president's ability to perform his constitutional duties. It is not in the Constitution itself. It is just DOJ policy, but it has been followed by every administration. As long as Trump is president, federal prosecutors will not bring charges against him. Jack Smith's cases were effectively frozen when Trump took office. The indictments still exist, the evidence still exists, but the prosecutions cannot move forward while he holds the office. This is why Trump was so desperate to win in 2024, and why he is already thinking about 2028 and beyond. Every day he remains president is a day he avoids potential prosecution. The second protection is the Supreme Court's immunity ruling in Trump versus United States. The court held that presidents have some immunity from criminal prosecution for official acts taken while in office. The ruling was narrower than Trump wanted. The court rejected his claim of absolute immunity for everything, but it still provides significant protection. Prosecutors now have to distinguish between official acts, which may be immune, and unofficial acts, which are not. This adds complexity to any prosecution and gives Trump's lawyers additional arguments to make. The immunity ruling does not make Trump untouchable, but it creates hurdles that prosecutors have to clear before they can proceed. The third protection is political control. As long as Republicans control enough of Congress to block impeachment and removal, Trump is safe from that avenue of accountability. As long as he can appoint loyalists to the Justice Department, he can prevent federal prosecutors from pursuing him. As long as he maintains support from the Republican base, elected officials are afraid to move against him. This political protection is what Trump was talking about when he warned Republicans that he would be impeached if they lose the midterms. He understands that his legal fate is tied to political outcomes. If Democrats take the House, impeachment becomes likely. If Democrats take the presidency in 2028, a new attorney general could revive the federal prosecutions. His survival depends on maintaining political power. The fourth factor is the statute of limitations. Criminal charges have to be brought within certain time limits. The clock is ticking on Trump's exposure. If he can stay in office long enough, if he can delay prosecutions long enough, some of the charges may become time-barred. This is why his legal strategy has always emphasized delay. Every motion filed, every appeal pursued, every procedural argument made, it is all designed to run out the clock. If Trump can make it to 2029 without being prosecuted, some of his legal exposure may expire. Not all of it, but some. That is part of his calculation. Now, what would have to change for Trump to actually face prison? Several things would need to happen. First, he would have to leave office, either by losing an election, reaching term limits, being impeached and removed, or dying in office. As long as he is president, federal prosecution is off the table. Second, a future administration would have to be willing to prosecute him. That is not guaranteed. Some people argue that prosecuting a former president would be too divisive or set a dangerous precedent. But Jack Smith has already shown that the evidence supports charges, and he has said he would bring them again. A future attorney general could pick up where Smith left off. Third, Trump would have to lose in court. He would be entitled to a trial with all the constitutional protections any defendant receives. He could be acquitted, but the evidence against him is strong. Smith said it proves guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, so conviction is a realistic possibility. The pattern of special treatment that Trump has received so far tells an important story. In the New York hush money case, he was convicted of 34 felonies, but received no jail time. Judge Mon explicitly noted that an ordinary defendant would have faced harsher consequences. Trump got an unconditional discharge, the lightest possible sentence, because of his unique status as a former and future president. Legal commentators have called this a double standard. If anyone else falsified 34 business records to cover up payments to a porn star before an election, they would be in prison. But Trump walks free because the system does not know how to handle a criminal defendant who is also the leader of a major political party and a former president. That double standard protects Trump, but it also proves something important. The courts are willing to convict him. They have found him guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. If the political circumstances were different, if Trump did not have the protections he currently enjoys, prison would be the result. Jack Smith's testimony to Congress reinforced how strong the evidence is. He told lawmakers that both federal cases were supported by proof beyond a reasonable doubt. He said the evidence showed Trump engaged in criminal activity, not might have engaged, not allegedly engaged, but did engage. He said the Espionage Act counts involved highly sensitive materials that Trump deliberately concealed from investigators. He said this is the kind of conduct that usually yields substantial prison time when ordinary defendants are convicted. Smith was making a point that cuts through all the political noise. If Donald Trump were anyone else, if he were just some random person who took classified documents and hid them from the FBI, he would be in federal prison right now. The only reason he is not is because he is Donald Trump, because he was president, because he has political power that shields him from consequences. That protection is real, but it is not permanent. Here is what Trump understands that many of his supporters do not fully grasp. His freedom depends entirely on maintaining political power. If he loses, if Republicans lose, if the political landscape shifts against him, everything changes. The federal cases can be revived. The Georgia case continues regardless. New charges could potentially be brought. And when prosecutors finally get a clear shot at him, when he is no longer shielded by the presidency and political allies, he faces sentencing guidelines that could put him away for 20 or 30 or 40 years. At his age, that is life in prison. That is dying behind bars. That is the end of everything he has built and everything he cares about. Trump is not fighting to stay in power because he loves public service. He is fighting because he is terrified of what happens when the power goes away. The talk of life in prison is escalating because more people are starting to understand this reality. Legal experts are doing the calculations and publishing the results. Jack Smith is testifying before Congress and confirming that the evidence supports serious charges. Courts are convicting Trump and documenting his criminal conduct, even when they stop short of imprisonment. Each piece of news, each ruling, each revelation adds to the picture of a man whose legal exposure is catastrophic. Trump can rage about witch hunts and political persecution. He can attack prosecutors and judges and anyone who questions him, but he cannot change the underlying facts. The evidence exists, the charges are documented, the sentencing guidelines are what they are, and if he ever loses the protection of political power, life in prison is not just talk. It is a realistic possibility that keeps him awake at night. If you want to stay informed about Trump's legal exposure, if you want to understand what the charges mean and how much prison time he actually faces, then subscribe to this channel right now. We are going to keep covering these cases as they develop. We are going to keep explaining the legal issues in plain language. We are going to keep bringing you the truth about what is happening, even when Trump and his allies try to dismiss it as fake news or political persecution. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to see it, and join the Pump Politics community, because the truth matters and you deserve to know it.